The spotlight felt like 1,000 suns burning down on Lorraine Washington's trembling hands. She sat frozen at the Steinway Grand, its polished black surface reflecting the sea of faces staring back at her from the darkness of the concert hall. 500 people, maybe more, all waiting, all watching. Her 58-year-old fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. This piano, this impossible moment. 3 years ago, she couldn't even touch a piano, couldn't bear to look at one. The sight of ivory keys and mahogany wood had been enough to shatter her into 1,000 pieces, each one sharp with grief and regret. But here she was, about to play her son's final composition in front of hundreds of strangers, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the microphones would pick it up. The conductor gave her a gentle nod. It was time. But to understand how Lorraine Washington ended up on this stage, trembling and terrified, and more alive than she'd felt in years, we have to go back. Back to where it all began. Back to a dusty apartment and a piano that had been silent for far too long. Back to the day everything changed. 3 years earlier, Lorraine stood in the doorway of her son's apartment for the first time since the funeral. The key felt heavy in her hand, foreign somehow, even though she'd carried it in her purse every single day for 36 months. Her daughter Sarah had offered to come with her to help sort through Devon's things to finally close this chapter. But Lorraine had said no. This was something she needed to do alone. The apartment smelled like absence, like time standing still. Dust particles floated in the afternoon light streaming through windows she used to nag Devon to clean. "Mama, I'm too busy practicing," he'd say with that smile that could melt her frustration every time. The dust can wait. Music can't. But now the music had waited. For 3 years, it had waited. The Steinway Grand dominated the small living room exactly as it always had, a massive presence that seemed even larger in the stillness. Model D, Concert Grand. Devon had sold his car to buy it, had eaten ramen for 6 months straight, had lived with 3 roommates in a studio apartment just to afford the payments. "It's not just a piano, Mama," he'd told her when she'd worried about the cost. "It's my voice. It's how I speak to the world." Lorraine stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor Devon had kept so carefully polished. The piano bench still sat at the same angle he'd left it adjusted to the exact height he preferred. His sheet music remained stacked on the music stand, the top piece showing his handwritten notations in the margins, his shorthand that only he could decipher. Had been able to decipher. She reached out, then pulled her hand back. 3 years, and she still couldn't bring herself to touch it. This instrument had been his everything, his passion, his purpose, his path to a world she didn't fully understand. A world of concert halls and standing ovations of European tours and prestigious awards. A world that had taken him away from her long before the cancer did. The last time she'd seen him play, really play, had been 2 weeks before the diagnosis. He'd been preparing for a performance at Carnegie Hall, his fingers flying across the keys with that supernatural grace that had amazed her since he was 7 years old. She'd stood in this same spot watching, and instead of feeling proud, she'd felt angry. Angry that the piano seemed to matter more to him than she did. Angry that he'd chosen this life of uncertainty and struggle instead of the stable career she'd wanted for him. She'd said something cruel. She couldn't remember the exact words now, but she remembered the look on his face, the way his hands had stilled on the keys, the way he'd turned to her and said quietly, "You've never understood, have you, Mama? You've never understood what this means to me." And she hadn't. Not then. Maybe not ever. 3 weeks later, he'd collapsed during a rehearsal. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, the doctors said. He got 7. 7 months of watching her strong, brilliant, impossibly talented son fade away. 7 months of regrets that piled up like unpaid bills, each one a reminder of every time she'd prioritized her own fears over his dreams. The piano had sat silent since the day of his diagnosis. "I can't play anymore, Mama," he'd whispered one night in the hospital, his voice thin and papery. "My hands don't work right. The music is still in my head, but I can't get it out." She'd held his hand and told him it was okay that he should rest, that the music could wait. But the truth was, she'd been almost relieved. Relieved that for once, she had him to herself. That the piano wasn't stealing him away. That finally, he was just her son again. God forgive her, but she'd been relieved. Now, standing here in the thick silence of his empty apartment, she wondered if that relief had been another sin to add to her growing collection. Another way she'd failed to understand what he needed. Another moment of selfishness, disguised as motherly concern. Lorraine sank onto the leather couch, the same one where Devon used to sprawl with his composition notebooks, scribbling melodies at 2 a.m. because inspiration didn't keep business hours. The cushion still held the faint indentation of his body, and she pressed her hand against it, as if she could somehow feel him there. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry I never understood." The piano stood silent, offering no absolution, just like it had for 3 long years. Devon Washington had been 7 years old the first time he touched a piano. Not this magnificent Steinway, but a beaten-up upright in the community center on Martin Luther King Boulevard, its keys yellowed with age, and several notes that stuck when you pressed them. Lorraine could still see him, small for his age, standing on tiptoe to reach the keys while she waited for her shift at County General Hospital to start. She'd been a nurse then, working doubles and sometimes triples to keep their small family afloat after Devon's father had walked out. Sarah was 10 old enough to watch her brother for a few hours after school, but Lorraine didn't like leaving them alone more than necessary. So 3 days a week she'd bring them to the community center, where they could do homework under supervision until she got off work. That particular afternoon, old Mr. Jenkins had been playing the piano, his arthritic fingers coaxing out a hymn Lorraine recognized from church. Devon had been mesmerized, abandoning his math worksheet to stand beside the elderly man, watching his hands move across the keys with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. "You want to try, young man?" Mr. Jenkins had asked, and Devon had nodded so vigorously Lorraine had been afraid he'd hurt his neck. What happened next had changed everything. Devon had sat on the bench, his small legs dangling, and placed his hands on the keys exactly as Mr. Jenkins had shown him. And then he'd played the hymn back. Not perfectly, not every note, but enough that Mr. Jenkins had sat back in shock, and Lorraine had dropped the magazine she'd been pretending to read. "How did you—" Mr. Jenkins had started, but Devon was already playing something else. Something that sounded like it might be another hymn, or might be something entirely new, his face scrunched in concentration, his fingers searching for sounds he could hear in his head. "Mrs. Washington," Jenkins had said, his voice shaking slightly. "Your boy has a gift, a real gift." Lorraine had been skeptical. Every parent thinks their child is special gifted, destined for greatness. She'd seen too many kids pushed into things they didn't love because their parents needed them to be exceptional. She wasn't going to be that mother. But Devon hadn't needed pushing. He'd needed holding back. Within a month, he was at the community center every afternoon, learning everything Mr. Jenkins could teach him. Within 6 months, he was playing pieces that made people stop in the hallways to listen. Within a year, Mr. Jenkins had sat Lorraine down with tears in his eyes and told her that Devon had surpassed everything he knew, that the boy needed a real teacher, real training, real opportunity. "I can't afford that," Lorraine had said flatly. She was already working every shift the hospital would give her, already skipping meals to make sure her kids had enough. Piano lessons with a real instructor cost money she simply didn't have. But Mr. Jenkins had connections. He'd made calls, he'd begged favors, and somehow miraculously, he'd found a teacher willing to work with Devon for free. Mrs. Chen, a Juilliard graduate who'd retired from performing and taught select students from her home in the better part of town. Lorraine had been suspicious of charity, of pity, of the implication that she couldn't provide for her own child. But when she'd met Mrs. Chen, the elegant elderly woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, those fears had evaporated. "I don't do this because I feel sorry for you," Mrs. Chen had said bluntly. "I do this because I heard your son play, and I haven't heard anything like it in 40 years of teaching. He has something rare, something precious, and it would be a crime against music itself to let that go to waste." So Devon had studied, and practiced, and grown. Lorraine remembered coming home from her shifts to find him at the community center piano at 8, 9, 10 at night. His small figure bent over the keys, chasing perfection with the determination of someone 3 times his age. She'd tried to make him stop, to make him play outside like other kids, to make him normal. But Sarah had grabbed her arm one evening and whispered, "Mama, let him be. Can't you see this isn't work for him? This is joy." And Sarah had been right. When Devon played something in him, lit up something that made him more himself than anything else in his young life. The piano wasn't a burden or a hobby. It was an extension of who he was, as essential as breathing. By the time he was 12, he'd won his first competition. By 14, he was playing in recitals with kids twice his age. By 16, he'd earned a full scholarship to a prestigious performing arts high school, the kind of place Lorraine had only seen in movies about rich kids with endless opportunities. "You're going to be somebody, baby," she'd told him on his first day straightening his tie in the morning light. "You're going to show them what a kid from our neighborhood can do." He'd hugged her tight, and she'd felt his heart beating fast with excitement and terror. "I'm already somebody, Mama," he'd said. "I'm your son, and I'm a pianist. That's all I need to be." She'd thought she understood what he meant, but she hadn't. Not really. She'd still seen the piano as a means to an end, a tool for success, a way out of their circumstances. She hadn't understood that for Devon, the music itself was the point. The success, the recognition, the opportunities, those were just side effects. The music was everything. Devon got into Juilliard at 17 with a full scholarship and stipend that made Lorraine cry when the acceptance letter arrived. Her baby, her brilliant boy, admitted to one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. She'd framed that letter, hung it in the living room where everyone could see it, proof that hard work and talent could overcome any obstacle. But what she'd thought would bring them closer had somehow begun to push them apart. The first semester, Devon had come home every weekend, full of stories about his professors, his fellow students, the incredible musicians he was learning from. He'd play for her on the community center piano, showing her new techniques, new pieces, new interpretations of old favorites. Lorraine had loved those evenings, loved having him to herself, loved being the center of his world again. But by sophomore year, the weekend visits had become bi-weekly, then monthly, then only on holidays. He was busy, he said. Rehearsals, performances, master classes, practice, always practice. The piano demanded more and more of him, and there seemed to be less and less left over for her. Lorraine had tried to be understanding. She knew he was working toward something important, building a career in an impossibly competitive field. But understanding didn't make the loneliness hurt less. Didn't make the empty chair at Sunday dinner any easier to bear. Didn't make her feel any less like she was losing her son to an instrument made of wood and wire. When he graduated summa cum laude at 21, she'd sat in the audience at Lincoln Center watching him perform his senior recital, and she'd felt pride and grief in equal measure. Pride at what he'd accomplished. Grief at how far he'd traveled from her. After the recital at the reception where elegant people in expensive clothes congratulated Devon and talked about music in ways Lorraine couldn't follow, he'd introduced her to his new manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Brennan, who talked about European tours and recording contracts like they were already done deals. "Your son is going to be a star, Mrs. Washington," Victoria had said, her smile perfect and professional. "We have opportunities lined up that most pianists would kill for. He could be the next great American classical pianist." Lorraine had smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but inside all she could think was, "I just want him to be my son. I just want him to come home." Devon's career had exploded in his early 20s. Performances in London, Paris, Vienna, a recording contract, reviews in prestigious publications that called him a virtuoso and a once-in-a-generation talent. He'd bought the Steinway with his first major paycheck, and Lorraine had helped him move it into his small apartment, watching as he'd caressed the keys with something close to reverence. "This is it, Mama," he'd said. "This is the one. I'm going to create something beautiful with this piano, something that will last." She'd wanted to say, "You already created something beautiful. You, your life, your presence in my world." But she'd swallowed the words, afraid they'd sound small and selfish compared to his grand ambitions. The distance between them had grown into a chasm, not from anger or resentment, but from something subtler and more painful incomprehension. Lorraine didn't understand his world of concert halls and international tours. Devon didn't understand why she couldn't share his excitement, why she seemed sad when he talked about his successes. Their conversations had become surface-level, polite updates about logistics and schedules. He'd call once a week, usually while traveling between cities, and they'd talk about the weather, about Sarah's kids, about anything except the things that mattered. The things they should have said to each other, but didn't know how. Lorraine had started to resent the piano. Not openly, not in a way she'd admit even to herself, but the feeling was there nonetheless. This instrument that had given Devon his purpose had somehow taken him away from her. Every performance, every accolade, every step forward in his career felt like a step away from her. The worst fight they'd ever had happened 2 months before his diagnosis. He'd been preparing for Carnegie Hall, the pinnacle of any classical musician's career, and he'd invited her to a rehearsal. Had stood in the empty concert hall, watching him practice the same passage over and over, chasing a perfection she couldn't hear the difference in. After an hour, she'd made the mistake of saying, "Devon, honey, it sounds perfect. Can't you take a break?" He'd spun around on the bench, his face flushed with frustration. "Perfect, Mama? The phrasing in measure 47 is completely wrong. The dynamics in the second movement aren't matching the emotional arc. The left hand voicing in the fugue is muddy. It's nowhere near perfect." "I don't hear any of that," she'd said, exhaustion making her words sharper than she'd intended. "I just hear my son playing beautiful music and working himself to death. For what? For people who wouldn't care about you if you couldn't play. For a career that's taken you away from your family." The silence that had followed had been devastating. "Is that what you think?" Devon had asked quietly. "That I do this for other people? That this is about career or recognition, isn't it?" She'd regretted the words the moment they left her mouth, but it was too late. "You're never home, Devon. You've missed birthdays, holidays, your niece's baptism, all for this. She'd gestured at this piano with something close to contempt. All for something that doesn't love you back. Devon had stood up from the bench, his hands shaking. You've never understood, have you, Mama? You've never understood what this means to me. This isn't about success or recognition. It's about expressing something I can't put into words. It's about touching something transcendent. It's about being fully alive in the only way I know how. And what about being alive with your family? The words had come out as almost a whisper. What about being here with us, with me? He'd looked at her then with an expression she'd never forget, a mixture of love and frustration and profound sadness. I can't be who you want me to be, Mama. I can only be who I am. And if you can't accept the music as part of me instead of competition for me, I don't know what else to say. She'd left before saying something worse, had driven home with tears blurring her vision, convinced that she'd been right, that he'd chosen the piano over her, that she'd somehow lost her son to an instrument. 3 weeks later, he'd collapsed during rehearsal. 3 weeks later, everything had changed. And now, standing in his silent apartment 3 years after his death, Lorraine would have given anything to take back those words, would have traded every moment of resentment for one more conversation, one more chance to understand, one more opportunity to tell him that she was proud that she loved him, that she'd been wrong about so many things. But the dead don't answer, and regrets don't fade just because you wish they would. The call had come on a Tuesday morning. Sarah, her voice tight with terror. Mama, you need to get to St. Vincent's. It's Devon. He collapsed during rehearsal, and they think it's bad. Lorraine had left work without clocking out, had driven through red lights and rush hour traffic with her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. Please, God, she'd prayed. Please, 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 take anything. Take everything. But not my baby. Not my boy. She'd found him in the emergency room, pale and small in the hospital gown, looking more like the 7-year-old who'd first touched a piano than the 29-year-old international performer he'd become. Sarah was there holding his hand, her face streaked with tears. Mama Devon had said when he saw her, and the relief in his voice had broken something in her chest. The doctors had come in with test results and careful expressions, the kind Lorraine had learned to read in her years as a nurse. The kind that said, I'm about to destroy your world. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Metastatic. The words had rolled over her like waves, each one pulling her further from shore. 6 months, maybe less. Treatment options limited. Chemotherapy might buy some time, but would likely do little else. How Lorraine had asked, because she needed there to be a reason, a cause, something to understand. He's 29. He's healthy. But cancer didn't care about age or health or brilliant futures cut short. Cancer was indiscriminate in its cruelty. Devon had been remarkably calm, as the doctors explained, had asked practical questions about treatment schedules and side effects, about what to expect, about timelines. It was Lorraine who'd fallen apart, who'd had to leave the room because she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't reconcile the word terminal with her vibrant, talented, impossibly alive son. Sarah had found her in the bathroom, hyperventilating into the sink. We have to be strong for him, Mama, her daughter had said, her own voice breaking. We have to be there for him now. And they had been. God, they'd tried. Devon had moved back home for the treatment, back to Lorraine's small house where he'd grown up. She'd converted her sewing room into a bedroom for him, had stocked the kitchen with all his favorite foods, had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to be his full-time caregiver. The first month he'd insisted on still practicing. He'd rented an electric keyboard that he could use with headphones, not wanting to disturb her, and she'd hear him late at night playing softly, the melody seeping through the walls like a ghost. But the chemotherapy had been brutal. The brilliant fingers that could execute the most complex passages with ease began to shake. The stamina that had carried him through 3-hour concerts evaporated. The perfect pitch that had defined his musical genius became unreliable as the drugs affected his hearing. "I can't play anymore, Mama," he'd told her one night, 3 months into treatment. They were sitting in the living room, the electric keyboard silent in the corner. "The music is still in my head, but my hands won't cooperate. It's like being trapped in a body that won't do what I need it to do." Lorraine had held him as he'd cried, this grown man reduced to the frightened child he'd once been, and she'd stroked his head and whispered the same things she'd said when he was small and scared. "It's okay, baby. Mama's here. Everything's going to be okay," even though they both knew it wouldn't be. The Carnegie Hall performance he'd been preparing for was canceled, then rescheduled for when he got better, then quietly removed from the schedule altogether. His manager Victoria had called weekly at first, then monthly, then not at all. The music world moved on. It had to. There were always new talents, new performances, new stars rising. But in those months, something unexpected had happened. With the piano silenced, Lorraine had gotten her son back. Not the international performer, not the prodigy, not the virtuoso. Just Devon, her boy. They'd watched old movies together, cooked meals side by side in the kitchen, looked through photo albums, and remembered. He'd told her stories about his travels, about the funny things that happened backstage, about the people he'd met. She'd told him about her childhood, about his grandmother. He'd never known about the dreams she'd had before she'd become a single mother, working double shifts. And slowly, carefully, they'd talked about the distance between them, about the resentment and the misunderstanding, about how much they'd both wanted to bridge the gap but hadn't known how. "I was never choosing the piano over you," Mama Devon had said one afternoon, his voice weak but earnest. "The piano was never separate from me. It was how I understood myself, how I expressed love, how I connected to something bigger than myself. When I played, I wasn't leaving you. I was trying to show you who I was." "I know that now," Lorraine had whispered, holding his thin hand. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." "I'm sorry too," he'd said. "Sorry I didn't try harder to explain. Sorry I let my passion make you feel abandoned. Sorry for a lot of things." They'd cried together, then purging years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. And in the wake of those tears, they'd found something precious: forgiveness, understanding, peace. The last 2 months had been the hardest. The cancer had spread to his bones, his liver, his lungs. Pain became his constant companion despite the morphine. He'd slept more and more, drifting in and out of consciousness. But there had been good moments too. Moments of clarity when he'd hold her hand and tell her he loved her. Moments when Sarah's children would visit and make him laugh with their silly stories. Moments when he'd hum melodies under his breath, still making music even when his hands couldn't. The night before he died, he'd been more lucid than he'd been in weeks. "Mama," he'd said, his voice papery thin, "I need to tell you something." "Save your strength, baby," she'd said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "No, I need to say this." He'd gripped her hand with surprising strength. "I left something for you. In the piano. The Steinway. Promise me you'll find it. Promise me you'll understand." "What is it, Devon? What did you leave?" But he'd been fading again, the effort of speaking exhausting him. "Promise, Mama. Promise you'll find it. Promise you'll finish it. I promise," she'd said, even though she didn't understand. "I promise, baby." He'd smiled then, peaceful and knowing. "Thank you. For everything. For being my mama. For loving me even when you didn't understand me. For everything. I love you, Devon. More than anything in this world." "I know," he'd whispered. "I always knew. And I love you too. So much, Mama. So much." Those had been his last coherent words. He'd slipped into unconsciousness that night and never woken up. Had died at 6:17 a.m. on a Sunday morning with Lorraine holding his hand and Sarah singing softly one of the hymns from the church of their childhood. The funeral had been large. Colleagues from the music world, former teachers, students he'd mentored, people whose lives he'd touched with his playing. They'd shared stories of his brilliance, his kindness, his dedication to his craft. And Lorraine had listened and nodded and accepted their condolences, all while feeling hollowed out, empty, like someone had reached inside and carved out everything essential. She'd had them close the casket before anyone could see his hands. Those beautiful, talented hands that had created such magic. She couldn't bear for people to see them still and silent, robbed of their purpose. And the Steinway she'd kept paying the rent on Devon's apartment month after month, unable to face sorting through his things, unable to deal with the piano that sat there like a monument to everything she'd lost. The executor of his small estate had asked several times what she wanted to do with it. Sell it, donate it, move it into storage. But she'd said no to everything. Just kept paying the rent, just kept avoiding. Until today, until 3 years had passed, and Sarah had finally convinced her that it was time. Time to let go. Time to move forward. Time to deal with the reality that Devon was gone and wasn't coming back. But standing here now, staring at the silent Steinway Lorraine, didn't feel ready. Didn't feel like she'd ever be ready. And then she remembered. His last words. The promise she'd made. I left something for you, in the piano. Promise me you'll find it. Lorraine's heart began to beat faster. In 3 years of grief and avoidance, she'd forgotten. Or maybe she'd made herself forget because dealing with it was too painful. But now the memory came flooding back clear as the moment Devon had spoken the words. He'd left something for her. In the piano. And she'd promised to find it. Lorraine's legs felt weak as she crossed the room to the Steinway. The afternoon light slanted across the keyboard, illuminating the thin layer of dust that had accumulated over 3 years of silence. Up close, she could see her reflection in the polished black surface, distorted and ghostly. She should clean it first, she thought. Should dust it. Should treat it with the respect such an instrument deserved. But her hands were already reaching out, drawn by something she couldn't name. Anticipation. Hope. Fear. Her fingers touched the fallboard, the wooden cover that protected the keys, and even through the dust she could feel the quality of the instrument. Smooth, expensive, the kind of craftsmanship Devon had obsessed over. She lifted the fallboard gently, revealing the keys beneath. Ivory and ebony. 88 keys. Each one a portal to sound, to music, to the world Devon had loved more than anything. More than her she'd once thought. But she knew better now. He hadn't loved the piano more than her. He'd loved music as a language to express what couldn't be said with words, including his love for her. If only she'd understood that when he was alive. Lorraine sat down on the bench, the leather cool through her slacks. The bench was adjusted to Devon's height, several inches too high for her, but she didn't change it. Sitting here, she could imagine him, could almost feel his presence. Almost. She pressed down on middle C. The note rang out pure and clear, cutting through 3 years of silence like a knife. Lorraine gasped, pulling her hand back as if the key had burned her. The sound hung in the air, sustained by the Steinway's famous resonance, seeming to fill every corner of the small apartment. Then it faded, and the silence rushed back in heavier than before. Tears blurred her vision. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry I can't play for you. I don't know how. I never learned." But he'd left something for her. In the piano. That's what he'd said. Lorraine looked at the instrument more carefully now, searching. Where would you hide something in a piano? She'd watched Devon practice thousands of times, but had never paid attention to the piano's structure, its hidden spaces, and secret compartments. She ran her hands along the music stand, the lid, the frame. Nothing seemed unusual. She opened the lid, fully propping it up to reveal the strings and hammers inside the complex machinery that transformed the pressure of fingers on keys into music. She'd always found the interior of the piano vaguely intimidating, all those strings under such tension, like something that could snap and cause damage if you weren't careful. Devon used to laugh at her nervousness. "It's perfectly safe, Mama," he'd say. "It's designed to withstand incredible forces. You can't hurt it just by looking." But he'd also treated it with reverence, had spent hours making minute adjustments to the action, the touch weight, the key dip. Each piano is different, he'd explained once. You have to learn its personality, its quirks. You have to develop a relationship with it, a relationship with an instrument. At the time, she'd thought that was silly. But now, looking at this magnificent machine that had been her son's partner in creating beauty, she thought maybe she understood a little better. Lorraine knelt down beside the bench, checking underneath the piano. Nothing there but dust and a few old performance programs that had fallen and been forgotten. She sat back, frustrated. Where else could he have hidden something? And then she noticed it. A slight irregularity in the key slipped the wooden piece that sat just in front of the keys. On the right side, there was a small gap, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A seam that didn't quite match up. Her heart started beating faster. She pressed gently on the key slip and it moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to confirm that something was there. Something that wasn't part of the original design. With trembling fingers, Lorraine worked at the seam, trying to figure out how it opened. Devon had always been clever with his hands, had always been able to fix things, to build things. If he'd created a hidden compartment, it would be elegant, subtle, perfectly integrated. There, a small indentation on the underside, barely large enough for a fingertip. She pressed it, and the key slip clicked, swinging open on a tiny hinge to reveal a space about 8 inches wide and 3 inches deep. Inside was a leather-bound journal and several pages of sheet music, the paper slightly yellowed with age. Lorraine's hands shook so badly she almost couldn't lift the journal out. It was worn, the leather soft from handling, and when she opened it to the first page, she saw Devon's handwriting. Not the quick scrawl he used for grocery lists or notes, but his careful script, the one he used when composing. The page was dated 4 years ago, a year before his diagnosis. The entry began simply, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, Mama. I don't even know if you'll ever find it. But I need to write this down, need to say the things I can never seem to say to your face." Lorraine's vision blurred with tears. She clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed. He'd written to her, had hidden his thoughts in the piano, trusting that somehow, someday, she'd find them. The promise she'd made in his final hours suddenly made sense. He'd been trying to tell her, had used his last moments of clarity to make sure she knew to look. "Promise me you'll find it. Promise me you'll understand." With shaking hands, Lorraine turned to the next page and began to read. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, Mama. I don't even know if you'll ever find it. But I need to write this down. Need to say the things I can never seem to say to your face. I know you think the piano took me away from you. I can see it in your eyes every time I cancel a visit home, every time I choose a rehearsal over dinner, every time I talk about a performance. And you smile, but the smile doesn't reach your eyes. You think I chose this life, this career, this instrument over you and Sarah and the family you raised me to value above everything. But Mama, the piano didn't take me away from you. The piano is me. Do you understand the difference? When I play, I'm not escaping from my life, or my family, or my responsibilities. I'm being most fully myself, most fully the person you raised me to be. Remember when I was 7, and Mr. Jenkins let me touch the piano for the first time? You asked me later what it felt like, and I said it felt like coming home. You laughed, thought I was being dramatic the way kids are. But I wasn't. I meant it literally. The moment my fingers touched those keys, something in me settled. Something I didn't even know was restless found its place. You gave me that, Mama. You're the one who brought me to the community center that day. You're the one who worked those extra shifts so I could have lessons. You're the one who drove me to competitions and recitals when you were so tired you could barely see straight. Every note I've ever played, every performance I've ever given, every moment of beauty I've been able to create. It all started with you believing in me. I wish I could make you understand that when I'm on stage, when I'm lost in the music, when my hands are flying across the keys and I'm channeling something bigger than myself, I'm not far away from you. I'm carrying you with me. Every lesson you taught me about dedication, about working hard, about not giving up when things get difficult, it's all there in my music. The scales I practice for hours, that's your voice telling me that anything worth doing is worth doing right. The way I approach a difficult passage, breaking it down piece by piece until I master it. That's you teaching me to be patient, to trust the process. The emotion I pour into a performance. That's every moment of love you showed me. Every sacrifice you made, every time you put my needs above your own. You didn't just give me life, Mama. You gave me the tools to live it fully. The piano isn't competition for your love. It's the expression of everything you taught me about what love means. Lorraine had to stop reading. Tears were streaming down her face, dropping onto the pages and smudging Devon's careful handwriting. She pressed the journal to her heart, rocking slightly, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. All these years, she'd felt abandoned, replaced, as if the piano had been a rival for her son's affection. But he'd never seen it that way, had never understood why she couldn't share his joy, because for him, the music and the family weren't separate things. They were the same thing. His love for her was woven into every note he played, and she'd been too blind, too wrapped up in her own hurt to see it. She wiped her eyes and turned the page. The next entry was dated 6 months later. I played Carnegie Hall tonight. Standing ovation, 5 encores. The Times called it transcendent. But all I could think about was you, Mama. About how you weren't there. About how I asked you to come and you said you had to work. But I know the hospital would have given you the night off. You didn't want to come. Didn't want to see me choosing the piano over family again. It hurt. God, Mama, it hurt so much. But I also understood. Or I'm trying to understand. Because I haven't been fair to you either. I've expected you to love the piano the way I do, to understand its language, to feel the same connection I feel. But why should you? It's not your passion. It's mine. And I've been so consumed by my own world that I haven't made enough space for you in it. I haven't asked about your job in months. Haven't remembered the name of that difficult patient you were worried about. Haven't noticed that you cut your hair, or that you've been tired lately, or that you probably need help with things you'd never ask for. I've taken and taken and taken. Your support, your love, your sacrifices, and I haven't given enough back. I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. Lorraine closed the journal, her heart breaking all over again. He'd been apologizing, thinking he was the one who'd failed when all along it had been her. Her inability to see past her own insecurities. Her need to make him choose between the music and his family when they'd never been in competition. She looked at the sheet music still sitting in the hidden compartment. Several pages filled with Devon's handwritten notes and measures, a composition. But unlike the printed scores that covered his music stand, this one had a title written at the top in his careful script, "For Mama." An unfinished symphony. Lorraine's breath caught. He'd written music for her, had composed something specifically meant to be hers. With trembling hands, she unfolded the pages. The composition was complex, far beyond anything she could ever play. But as she looked at the notes, even without being able to hear them, she could see patterns that seemed familiar. Fragments of melodies she'd hummed while cooking. Rhythms that matched the way she walked. The lullaby she used to sing to him when he was small, transformed and woven through the piece like a golden thread. He'd taken her, his mother, and turned her into music. At the bottom of the last page in the margin, Devon had written a note. "Mama, if you're reading this, something happened to me. Please don't cry. Or cry if you need to, but know that I'm at peace. Know that I loved you more than I ever knew how to say. This piece is unfinished because I ran out of time, but I'm leaving it to you because I want you to finish it. Not by writing music. You don't need to know how to compose. Finish it by playing it, by learning it, by making the piano speak the words we could never quite say to each other. I know you don't play. I know you think you can't. But Mama, you can. I believe in you the way you always believed in me. Learn this piece. Make it yours. And when you play it, you'll understand. You'll understand everything I couldn't find the words to tell you." Lorraine read the note 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her heart. He wanted her to play this, to learn piano at 58 years old, to master a piece that looked impossibly complex, to finish what he'd started. It was absurd. She'd never touched a piano in her life, had no musical training, no experience, no foundation. Learning to play would be difficult for anyone. At her age, with no background, it would be nearly impossible. But he'd believed she could do it, had trusted her with his final composition, had left it unfinished specifically so she could complete it. How could she refuse? Lorraine looked at the Steinway, this magnificent instrument that had been her rival and was now her connection to her son. She thought about all the hours Devon had spent at this bench, all the beauty he'd created, all the love he'd poured into his playing. Love for music, yes, but also love for her. Love that she'd been too hurt to see, too stubborn to accept. She thought about his final request, his last gift. This challenge he'd left her, this impossible task that was really a message: I believe in you. I trust you. I want you to understand me in the only language I truly knew how to speak. The journal had more pages, months, maybe years of entries she hadn't read yet. But right now, Lorraine couldn't read more. Her heart was too full, her emotions too raw. She carefully placed the journal back in its hiding place along with the sheet music. Tomorrow, or next week, or whenever she felt strong enough, she'd read more. But for now, she had a decision to make. An impossible decision that felt like the most important choice of her life. Could she do this? Could she learn to play piano at 58? Could she master this piece Devon had written for her? Could she finish what he'd started? And in doing so, finally, truly understand her son. Lorraine looked down at her hands. Nurse's hands, practical and strong. Hands that had changed diapers and dressed wounds and held her dying son in his final moments. Not a musician's hands, not pianist's hands, but they were her hands. And if Devon believed they could learn to make music to speak the language he'd spoken to, complete his final gift, then maybe she owed it to him to try. Maybe she owed it to herself. Lorraine sat at the Steinway for a long time, just staring at the keys. 88 keys, each one a portal to a world she'd never entered. Devon's world. A world of beauty and discipline, of emotion translated into sound, of connection beyond words. She pressed middle C again, then the notes on either side. Do, re, mi. The sounds were pure clear, each one hanging in the air before fading. She tried a few more notes, random and discordant, nothing that resembled actual music. Her fingers felt clumsy on the keys, uncertain. This was impossible. She was being ridiculous. You couldn't learn piano at her age, not when you had no musical background, no sense of rhythm, no ability to read sheet music. And even if she could learn the basics, Devon's composition was far beyond beginner level. It would take years to develop the skill needed to play it, years she might not have. And yet Devon had believed she could do this, had left her this challenge, this gift, this bridge between his world and hers, had trusted that somehow she would find a way. Lorraine pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she called Sarah. Mama, you okay? How's the apartment, Sarah, baby? I need you to help me find a piano teacher. There was a long pause. I'm sorry, what a piano teacher. Someone who teaches adults. Someone patient. Lorraine's voice was shaking, but determined. I need to learn how to play. Mama, are you sure this is a good idea? You're already emotional, and being in Devon's apartment, I found something, Sarah. Something Devon left for me. A piece of music he wrote. He wanted me to play it. To finish it. Another pause, longer this time. Lorraine could hear her daughter breathing, processing. Sarah had always been the practical one, the voice of reason. She'd want details, want to understand fully before committing to something this unusual. Tell me what you found, Sarah said finally. So Lorraine did. She explained about the hidden compartment, about the journal, about the composition titled For Mama. She read Devon's note aloud, her voice breaking on the words, I believe in you. When she finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then she heard Sarah crying softly. Oh, Mama, her daughter whispered. Oh, Devon. I know it's crazy, Lorraine said. I know I'm probably too old, probably don't have the aptitude, probably can't actually learn this. But Sarah, I have to try. I promised him. And more than that, I need to understand, need to speak his language, even if it's just this once. Need to finish what he started. It's not crazy, Sarah said firmly. It's beautiful and brave and exactly what Devon would have wanted. She took a shaky breath. I know someone. One of my neighbors teaches piano. She studied at Juilliard. She might remember Devon. Lorraine's heart skipped. Would she teach someone like me? Someone with no experience? Let me call her. Let me explain. And Mama Sarah's voice was gentle. Don't underestimate yourself. You raised 2 kids alone, worked your way up to head nurse, survived losing the most precious person in your life. If anyone can do something impossible, it's you. After they hung up, Lorraine sat in the quiet apartment for a while longer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. The piano seemed to glow in the fading light, as if lit from within. She thought about Devon's last days, about the conversations they'd finally had, the understanding they'd finally reached. She thought about all the years of resentment and misunderstanding, about how she'd made the piano into an enemy when it had really been a gift. Her phone rang. Sarah. Her name is Patricia Chen. She's Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, actually. She remembers Devon from when he was little, before her grandmother died. She'd be honored to teach you. Sarah paused. Mama. She started crying when I told her about the composition. She said Devon was one of the most naturally talented students her grandmother ever had. She wants to help you finish his work. Lorraine closed her eyes, overwhelmed. When can I start? Tomorrow if you want. I gave her your number. She'll call you. That night back in her own home, Lorraine couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Devon's journal, about the entries she hadn't read yet, about what other secrets he'd hidden in those pages, about what else she might learn about her son, about his inner life, about the things he'd felt but never said. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and went to her computer. She spent an hour watching YouTube videos about how to sit at a piano, how to position your hands, how to understand basic musical notation. The information was overwhelming, technical, full of terms she didn't understand. But she watched anyway, taking notes like she used to do in nursing school, determined to absorb as much as possible. At 3 a.m., she made herself tea and pulled out the photo albums. Pictures of Devon at 7 beaming next to Mr. Jenkins at the community center piano. Devon at 12 serious and focused at his first competition. Devon at 17 on his first day at Juilliard, looking excited and terrified. Devon at 25 taking a bow at the Sydney Opera House, looking like he'd finally found his place in the world. And pictures of them together. The two of them at his high school graduation. At Sarah's wedding where he'd played the processional. At her 60th birthday party just 3 months before his diagnosis, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling. She'd been so busy being hurt that she'd missed so many moments of joy. So busy feeling abandoned that she'd failed to see how desperately he'd tried to include her, to make her part of his world even when she'd rejected it. But it wasn't too late to understand. It wasn't too late to learn his language, to speak in music the things they'd struggled to say in words. It wasn't too late to honor his gift, to complete his composition, to finally truly see him for who he'd been. Devon had left her a bridge, a way across the chasm of misunderstanding that had separated them. And she was going to cross it no matter how hard the journey, no matter how long it took. At 4 a.m., exhausted, but unable to stop, Lorraine pulled up the video again of Devon's last major performance, recorded just 3 months before his diagnosis. She'd watched it once at the funeral, but couldn't bear to watch it again. Until now. She pressed play. Devon walked onto the stage of the concert hall, young and healthy and vibrantly alive. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench with those precise movements she remembered so well, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, gathering himself. Then he began to play. The piece was Rachmaninoff, one of his favorites. Complex and emotional, technically demanding, full of passion and power. Devon's hands flew across the keys with supernatural grace, drawing out sounds that seemed impossible for one person to create. His face was a study in concentration, and joy lost in the music transported. And for the first time watching him, Lorraine understood. She saw what he'd been trying to tell her all along. The piano wasn't a rival for his affection. The music wasn't what took him away from her. This was how he connected. This was how he loved. This was how he touched the divine and tried to bring it back to share with the world. When he played like this, he wasn't escaping his family. He was expressing everything his family had given him, everything he felt, everything he was. The discipline, the passion, the dedication, the love. It was all there in the music. And she'd been too angry, too hurt to hear it. But she heard it now. The video ended with thunderous applause and Devon taking a bow, his face flushed with the exertion and emotion of the performance. He looked so alive, so perfectly, completely himself. Lorraine closed the laptop and sat in the dark living room, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of grief this time, tears of understanding, of gratitude for the gift he'd left her, of determination to honor it. Her phone buzzed with a text. Sarah, who apparently also couldn't sleep. Patricia will call you at 9 a.m. Get some rest, Mama. You're going to need your strength. Learning piano is hard, but you've done harder things. I love you. Lorraine smiled through her tears and texted back. I love you too, baby. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for understanding. She went to bed then, and this time she slept. Deeply and dreamlessly. And when she woke at 8 a.m. to sunlight streaming through her window, she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. Hope. A reason to move forward instead of dwelling in the past. Devon had given her that. One last gift from beyond the grave. A challenge that was really an invitation. A composition that was really a conversation waiting to happen. And Lorraine Washington was ready to begin. Patricia Chen was nothing like Lorraine had expected. She'd imagined someone severe and intimidating, someone who would judge her lack of skill and question whether this whole endeavor was even possible. Instead, the woman who arrived at Lorraine's door at 10 a.m. on Saturday was in her early 40s, dressed in jeans and a soft sweater, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Mrs. Washington, Patricia said, extending her hand. It's an honor to meet you. Devon spoke of you often. He did. Lorraine was surprised. All the time, especially toward the end. Patricia's smile turned sad. My grandmother taught him when he was young before she passed. She always said he was special, that he had something she'd only seen a handful of times in her 50 years of teaching. When I heard about his diagnosis, about his death, she paused, gathering herself. It felt like the world lost something irreplaceable. Lorraine led her into the living room, where she'd set up a small keyboard she'd rented. It wasn't a Steinway, wasn't even close, but it was a start. Patricia looked at it and smiled. Good instinct, starting with something less intimidating than a grand piano. We'll work up to the Steinway. She set her bag down and pulled out several books. Sarah told me about the composition Devon left you, about what he asked you to do. Would you mind if I saw it? Lorraine had brought the sheet music home from Devon's apartment, had spent hours staring at it, trying to make sense of the notes and symbols. She handed the pages to Patricia carefully, as if they were made of glass. Patricia studied the music for a long time, her expression shifting from curiosity to wonder to something close to awe. This is... Mrs. Washington, this is extraordinary. This is some of his best work, and I can see what he did here. She pointed to a passage in the middle. These phrases, they're based on simple folk melodies. See this one? This is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And here woven in is His Eye is on the Sparrow, songs you probably sang to him when he was little. Lorraine's breath caught. She had sung those songs to him. Every night when he was small, tucking him into bed, her voice soft in the darkness. He took your lullabies and transformed them into something new. Patricia continued. Something that honors where he came from while showing where he went. It's a bridge, Mrs. Washington, between his past and his future. Between your world and his, between... She paused, her voice thick with emotion. Between a mother and a son who loved each other but spoke different languages. Lorraine had to look away, blinking back tears. Patricia set the music down gently. I'm going to be honest with you. This piece is advanced. Very advanced. For someone with no musical background learning to play, this would normally take years, maybe a decade. Lorraine's heart sank. So it's impossible. I didn't say that. Patricia's voice was firm. I said it would normally take years, but we're not in a normal situation, are we? You're not learning piano because you want a hobby, or because you think it might be fun. You're learning because you made a promise to your dying son. You're learning because you need to finish what he started. That kind of motivation. That changes things. I don't understand. Patricia sat down on the couch, gesturing for Lorraine to join her. When my grandmother taught, she used to say that the best students weren't the ones with the most natural talent. They were the ones with the strongest why. The ones who had a reason that went deeper than just wanting to play pretty music. Devon was one of those students. He played because he had to, because it was how he understood himself and the world. And you think I have that kind of motivation? I know you do. I can hear it in your voice. I can see it in your eyes. Patricia leaned forward. Mrs. Washington, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Your fingers are going to hurt. You're going to want to quit 100 times. You're going to feel frustrated and inadequate and angry. But if you stick with it, if you trust the process, if you give me everything you've got, I believe we can get you playing this piece. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not the way Devon would have played it, but well enough to honor his gift, well enough to finish his composition, well enough to say in music the things you never got to say in words. Lorraine thought about Devon's journal, about the entries she'd read, and the ones she hadn't, about all the years of misunderstanding and the few precious months at the end when they'd finally started to see each other clearly, about the promise she'd made and the gift he'd left. How long do you think it will take? She asked. Patricia considered. If you practice every day, multiple hours a day, if you're disciplined and committed, maybe a year, yes, possibly 2. It depends on how quickly you pick up the fundamentals and how well you can translate knowledge into physical skill. A year? 2 years. At her age, that felt like forever. But what else did she have? What else was she working toward? What better way to spend her time than honoring her son, understanding him, completing what he'd started? When can we start? Lorraine asked. Patricia smiled. Right now, if you're ready. Let me show you how to sit at the piano. The first month was torture. Lorraine had thought naively that since she could appreciate music, could hear when something sounded good or bad, that she'd have some natural aptitude for creating it. She'd been wrong. Her fingers didn't want to cooperate. They were stiff and clumsy, used to 40 years of nursing work, not the delicate precision required for piano. Patricia taught her scales, the basic building blocks of music, and Lorraine practiced them until her hands cramped, until she could barely grip a coffee cup the next morning. C major, G major, D major, over and over and over. Up the keyboard, down the keyboard, one hand, then the other, then both, together. It sounded simple. It wasn't. You're tensing your shoulders, Patricia would say gently. Relax. Let your arms hang naturally. The weight comes from here. She'd touch Lorraine's shoulder, demonstrating. Not from your wrists, not from your fingers. From the core of your body, through your arms into the keys. But Lorraine's body didn't understand. 58 years of holding tension in her shoulders, of bracing herself against the world, didn't undo itself just because she wanted it to. Every time Patricia pointed it out, Lorraine would relax for maybe 30 seconds before tensing up again. And reading music. That was its own special nightmare. The staff, the clefs, the time signatures, the key signatures, sharps and flats and naturals, whole notes and half notes and quarter notes and eighth notes and rests and dynamics and articulation markings. It was like learning a foreign language, except this language didn't have words, just symbols that somehow translated into specific physical actions that produced specific sounds. Devon had read music the way other people read English, fluently and without conscious effort. Lorraine felt like she was decoding hieroglyphics. It gets easier, Patricia promised. Right now you're thinking about every single element consciously. Eventually it becomes automatic. You see the note, your hand goes to the right key, You don't have to translate in your head anymore." When Lorraine asked, frustrated to the point of tears after a particularly difficult lesson. "When does it get easier, different for everyone? But you're making progress even if you can't see it yet. 3 weeks ago, you didn't know what middle C was. Now you can play a C major scale with both hands. That's huge progress." It didn't feel huge, it felt glacial. At this rate, she'd be 70 before she could play Devon's composition. Maybe 80. But she kept going. Every morning at 6 a.m., before her brain could talk her out of it, she sat at the keyboard and practiced. Scales exercises, simple melodies from the beginner books Patricia had given her. Mary had a little lamb. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Songs she'd sung to Devon when he was a baby, now being played by her own inexpert fingers, each note a struggle. Sometimes she cried while practicing. Sometimes she was so frustrated she had to walk away, pace around the house, remind herself why she was doing this. On those days, she'd pull out Devon's journal, read another entry, let his words give her strength. "Mama, you taught me that anything worth doing requires sacrifice. That easy things don't change us, don't make us grow. You worked double shifts for years to give me and Sarah a better life. You sacrificed your own comfort, your own dreams because you loved us. That's what I think about when a piece feels impossible, when my fingers won't do what I need them to do, when I want to give up. I think Mama didn't give up on me. I won't give up on this." So she didn't give up. Even when her fingers ached. Even when her brain felt overloaded with information it couldn't process. Even when she was certain she was the worst piano student who had ever lived. Patricia came twice a week, patient and encouraging, always finding something to praise, even in Lorraine's most pathetic attempts. "Good job keeping your thumb under on that scale. I liked how you shaped that phrase. Your rhythm is getting more consistent." And very slowly, so slowly, Lorraine almost didn't notice things started to click. Her fingers began to remember where the notes were. Her brain started to recognize patterns in the sheet music. The translation from symbol to action became fractionally faster. After 2 months, she could play simple pieces from the beginner book without stopping to figure out every single note. After 3 months, Patricia introduced the first of Devon's melodies, the simplified version of Swing Low Sweet Chariot that appeared in his composition. "Learn this," Patricia said. "Make it beautiful. This is your voice in his piece, your contribution. When you play the full composition, eventually this phrase will remind you that you belong in this music, that it's not just his creation, it's yours too." Lorraine practiced that melody for weeks, trying to make it sing, trying to infuse it with the same love she'd felt when singing it to her baby boy decades ago. And one day, playing it through for the 20th time, she heard it. Really heard it. The way the notes connected, the way the phrase breathed, the way it expressed something beyond just the technical execution. For the first time, she was making music. Not just hitting the right notes, but creating something that moved from mechanical to meaningful. She called Patricia immediately. "I did it. I actually did it. I made it sound like music." Patricia's voice was warm with pride. "I knew you would. This is just the beginning, Mrs. Washington. Just the beginning." 6 months into her piano journey, Lorraine moved Devon's Steinway from his apartment into her living room. It cost a fortune to have it professionally transported, cost even more to have it tuned and regulated after the move. But it was worth it. Practicing on the real instrument, the one Devon had played, made everything feel more immediate, more connected. The Steinway responded differently than the cheap keyboard she'd started on. It was more sensitive, more expressive, capable of infinite gradations of tone and volume. It was also more unforgiving. Every mistake, every imperfection was magnified. Patricia had approved the move. "You need to get used to how this particular piano feels, sounds, responds." Devon customized the action on this instrument. It's set up for his hands, his touch. You'll need to adjust, learn its personality. Learning the Steinway's personality was like getting to know Devon all over again. The keys were weighted, precisely the touch calibrated to his preferences. The sound, even when Lorraine played simple exercises, was magnificent, rich, and resonant, filling her small house with tones that seemed to have color and texture. She could imagine him here at this piano creating beauty. And sometimes, late at night when she was practicing, she almost felt like he was there with her, guiding her hands, encouraging her. The journal had become her companion. She'd read through it completely once, then started over absorbing Devon's thoughts, his struggles, his love. He'd written about performances, about the pressure of expectation, about the joy of discovering a new piece of music. But mostly, he'd written about family, about her and Sarah, about memories of his childhood, about regrets and hopes and love. One entry written a year before his diagnosis had nearly broken her. I called Mama today to tell her about the Paris performance. She was happy for me, said all the right things, but I could hear it in her voice, the distance, the sadness. She thinks I don't notice, but I do. I notice everything about her. The way her voice changes when she's hurt, but trying to hide it. The way she pauses before saying, "That's wonderful, baby." Like she's reminding herself to be supportive, even though she wishes I was talking about something else. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make her understand that every success, every performance, every moment on stage, it's all for her. Everything I am because she made me possible. But I can't seem to say that in a way she hears. Maybe the music will say it for me. Maybe someday she'll listen to me play and finally understand. This isn't me leaving her. This is me honoring her, every single day. Lorraine had cried for an hour after reading that. All the phone calls where she'd been distant, where she'd let her hurt override her pride in him. All the times she'd said, "That's wonderful, baby," when she'd really wanted to say, "When are you coming home?" All the opportunities to understand him that she'd missed because she was too busy nursing her own wounds. But she understood now. And the piano, this instrument she'd once resented, had become the bridge between their two worlds. Every day she practiced, every small improvement she made brought her closer to him, closer to understanding, closer to finishing what he'd started. The piece was coming together slowly. Patricia had broken it into sections, teaching Lorraine one measure at a time, one phrase at a time. They worked from the easiest parts to the hardest, building her skills gradually. The right-hand melody that incorporated his eye is on the sparrow took Lorraine 3 weeks to master. The left-hand accompaniment, with its complex rhythmic patterns, took 2 months. Putting them together took another month. "Don't get discouraged," Patricia said when Lorraine was ready to throw something. "You're doing in months what takes most people years. Yes, you make mistakes. Yes, it's messy. But you're actually doing it. You're actually playing music your son composed. Do you understand how extraordinary that is?" Lorraine didn't always feel extraordinary. Most days she felt frustrated and inadequate. But there were moments, brief glimpses, when everything came together. When her hands found the right notes at the right time with the right touch. When the music flowed instead of stuttered. When she could hear, just for a second, what Devon had imagined when he wrote this. Those moments made everything worthwhile. Month 8 brought a breakthrough. Lorraine was working on the bridge section, a particularly challenging passage that modulated to a different key and required her to play more notes than she had fingers. She'd been struggling with it for weeks, unable to get her hands to move independently, unable to maintain the tempo. And then one Tuesday afternoon, something clicked. Her left hand found its rhythm. Her right hand found its melody. and for 16 glorious measures she played the passage cleanly, musically, beautifully. She sat at the piano afterwards, stunned. Had that really just happened? Had her hands, her brain, her body finally understood what to do? She tried again. And again it worked. Not perfectly, but well enough that she could hear Devon's intention, could feel the emotion he'd written into the notes. Lorraine called Patricia, called Sarah, called everyone she could think of. I did it. I played the bridge section. It actually sounded like music. The celebration was short-lived. The next day, trying to repeat her success, Lorraine couldn't play the passage to save her life. Whatever magic had happened yesterday was gone. She was back to stumbling through, making mistakes, feeling like she'd never get it right. "This is normal," Patricia explained. "Progress isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days. Days when everything clicks and days when your brain can't remember things you've known for months. The key is to keep showing up. Keep practicing trust that you're building neural pathways even when it doesn't feel like it." So Lorraine kept showing up, even on days when she didn't want to, even on days when everything sounded terrible, even on days when her hands hurt and her head hurt, and she questioned whether any of this was worth it. On those hard days, she'd remember Devon's last words to her. "Promise me you'll finish it." She'd remember his faith in her, his belief that she could do this impossible thing, and she'd sit back down at the piano and try again. Month 10 brought another milestone. Patricia brought a metronome to their lesson, a device that clicked at a steady tempo. "We need to work on your timing," she explained. "Right now you slow down in the difficult parts and speed up in the easy parts. You need to learn to maintain a consistent pulse." Playing with the metronome was maddening. The relentless click, click, click never adjusted for Lorraine's mistakes, never gave her time to figure things out, never slowed down when she needed it to. But it also forced her to develop discipline to keep moving forward, even when her fingers didn't want to cooperate. After a month of metronome practice, Patricia had her play without it. The difference was remarkable. Lorraine's internal sense of timing had improved dramatically. The music flowed with a steadiness it had never had before. "You're really getting there," Patricia said, and there were tears in her eyes. "I can hear Devon in this now. I can hear his voice coming through your playing." By month 11, Lorraine could play most of the composition from beginning to end. Not perfectly, not at the right tempo, not with all the dynamics and expression marks Devon had indicated. But she could get through it. Could make it sound, if not exactly like music, at least like the suggestion of music. "We're entering the final phase," Patricia told her. "Now it's not about learning the notes anymore. It's about interpretation, about making this piece yours, about finding the emotion in it and expressing that through your playing." This was the hardest part yet. Lorraine could hit the right notes most of the time, but making them mean something, making them express the love and regret and understanding she felt, that required a level of skill and sensitivity she wasn't sure she possessed. "Tell me about Devon," Patricia said during one lesson. "Tell me about a specific memory, something that makes you feel deeply." Lorraine thought for a moment, then told her about Devon's 7th birthday. They'd been so poor that year. Lorraine had been working double shifts just to pay rent and put food on the table. She couldn't afford a proper party, couldn't afford presents, could barely afford a cake. But Devon had been so sweet about it, had told her that all he wanted for his birthday was for her to sing to him, just her singing the lullabies she sang every night. So that evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Lorraine had sat with Devon in his small bedroom and sung every song she knew. Hymns from church folk songs her own mother had taught her, silly rhymes she'd made up. And Devon had listened with his eyes closed, peaceful and happy, like it was the greatest gift he'd ever received. "Now play the opening," Patricia said quietly. Lorraine placed her hands on the keys and played. And somehow remembering that moment, remembering that little boy who'd wanted nothing but her voice, she played differently. The notes were the same, but they carried emotion now, weight, meaning. They told a story. When she finished both, she and Patricia were crying. That, Patricia said. That's what this piece needs. That's what Devon wanted you to bring to it, not technical perfection. Your love, your memories, your heart. Month 12, a full year of lessons, of practice, of struggling and persevering, and slowly and possibly learning to speak Devon's language. Lorraine could play the composition now. Not perfectly, but honestly. With feeling, with the love it was meant to express. Patricia sat down with her after a lesson, her expression serious. "I think you're ready. Ready for what to perform. To share this. To finish what Devon started the way he meant it to be finished." Lorraine's heart started racing. Perform in front of people. "Patricia, I can barely play this without making mistakes. I'm not a performer. I'm just a mother trying to honor her son." "Exactly. That's exactly why you should perform." Patricia leaned forward. "Mrs. Washington, this piece isn't meant to be played alone in your living room. It's meant to be shared. Devon wrote it as a gift for you, yes, but also as his final musical statement. His last composition. Don't you think people who loved him, who were touched by his music, would want to hear it? But I'll mess up. I'll embarrass myself. I'll embarrass his memory." "You won't. And even if you make mistakes, so what? This isn't about technical perfection. It's about love. It's about a mother honoring her son. It's about completing a gift he left unfinished. Trust me. Anyone who hears the story, anyone who understands what this means, they won't care if you miss a few notes." Lorraine felt panic rising in her chest. Performing meant pressure, meant stakes, meant the possibility of failure. What if she froze? What if her mind went blank? What if she couldn't do it when it mattered most? "I'll think about it," she said weakly. But Patricia was persistent. Over the next week, she called several times, each time with a new angle. "I talked to the head of the music department at the community college. They'd love to host a memorial concert for Devon. They have a beautiful recital hall. I reached out to some of Devon's former colleagues. They're all excited about the possibility of hearing his final composition." "Mrs. Washington, I really think this is what Devon wanted. Why else would he have left the piece unfinished? He wanted you to complete it publicly, to share it, to make it your own." Finally, one evening, Lorraine pulled out the journal and reread the note Devon had left with the composition. Finish it by playing it, by learning it, by making the piano speak the words we could never quite say to each other. Making the piano speak. Not just to herself in the privacy of her living room, but out loud, in front of others. Completing the conversation he'd started but couldn't finish. Maybe Patricia was right. Maybe this piece was meant to be shared. Lorraine called her back. "Okay, I'll do it, but not at a college recital hall. I want to do it somewhere that meant something to Devon." Where Lorraine thought for a moment, then knew. The community center, where he first learned to play, where Mr. Jenkins taught him, where it all started. If they still have that old piano, I want to play there. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Let me make some calls." 2 days later, Patricia called back with the details. The community center would host a memorial concert for Devon on the anniversary of his death 3 months away. They'd refurbished the old upright piano Mr. Jenkins had used, and it was in decent shape. They'd invite the community former teachers, anyone who'd known Devon or been touched by his music. 3 months, Lorraine repeated, feeling sick. That's not much time. It's enough. You know the piece. Now you just need to practice performing it. We'll do mock performances, work on managing nerves, get you comfortable with playing in front of people. The next 3 months were the most intense of Lorraine's life. She practiced the composition daily, multiple times through. Patricia brought friends to listen, creating an audience, getting Lorraine used to the pressure of performing. At first, Lorraine could barely get through the opening measures without her hands shaking. The presence of other people, even just Patricia's colleagues, made her freeze up. Forget everything she'd learned. It's normal, Patricia assured her. Performance anxiety affects everyone. Even Devon used to get nervous before concerts. He did, of course. Being nervous means you care. It means this matters to you. The trick is learning to use that energy instead of letting it paralyze you. They worked on breathing techniques, on mental preparation, on ways to stay grounded when panic threatened. Lorraine learned to focus on the music itself, not on the people watching. Learned to treat each performance like a conversation with Devon, a private moment that happened to have witnesses. Slowly, it got easier. Not easy, but easier. She could play through the piece in front of a small audience without falling apart. Could recover when she made mistakes instead of stopping completely. Could even on her best days forget that anyone was watching and just lose herself in the music. Sarah came to one of the practice performances bringing her kids. Watching their grandmother play piano, especially music written by the uncle they'd never met, brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Mama, you're amazing," Sarah said afterward, hugging her tight. "Devon would be so proud." "I wish he could hear it," Lorraine whispered. "I wish I could play this for him one more time." "He does hear it," Sarah said firmly. "Wherever he is, he hears it. And he knows what you've done. He knows how hard you've worked. He knows how much you love him." Lorraine hoped that was true. Hoped that somehow, wherever Devon was, he knew she'd kept her promise. That she'd learned his language. That she'd finished what he'd started. The week before the performance, Lorraine couldn't sleep. She practiced until her fingers ached, ran through the piece in her head at all hours, worried about every possible thing that could go wrong. Patricia had to remind her to rest. You can't practice yourself into perfection. You're as prepared as you're going to be. Now you need to trust yourself. Trust the work you've put in. Trust that when the moment comes, you'll be able to do what you've been practicing for a year. The night before the concert, Lorraine sat alone at the Steinway in her living room. She played through Devon's composition one more time, slowly and carefully savoring each note. This was it. Tomorrow, she would perform this publicly. Tomorrow, she would complete Devon's gift. Tomorrow, she would speak in music the love she'd struggled to express in words. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Get some sleep, Mama. Tomorrow is going to be beautiful. I love you." Lorraine texted back. "I love you too. Thank you for believing in me, for helping me do this impossible thing." Then she went to bed and surprisingly slept soundly. Dreamed of Devon young and healthy sitting at the piano and smiling at her. In the dream he said, "You're ready, Mama. You've always been ready. You just didn't know it yet." She woke up believing him. The community center looked exactly as Lorraine remembered, and completely different at the same time. They'd renovated the main hall, added new lighting, refinished the floors. But the bones of the building were the same. The same place where 7-year-old Devon had first touched a piano. The same place where Mr. Jenkins had recognized a gift that would change all their lives. Lorraine arrived 2 hours early per Patricia's instructions. She needed time to warm up, to get comfortable with the piano she'd be playing, to settle her nerves. Sarah came with her, along with Patricia, both of them providing moral support and practical help. The old upright piano had been placed on a small stage at one end of the hall. It wasn't a Steinway. It wasn't even close. But it was the piano Devon had learned on, and there was something poetic about that. Something that made the circle complete. "Go ahead and play a bit," Patricia encouraged. "Get used to how it feels." Lorraine sat at the bench, positioning herself the way Patricia had taught her. The piano was slightly out of tune, and several keys stuck a bit when she pressed them, but it had character history meaning. She started to run through the piece and immediately felt the difference from her Steinway at home. The action was heavier, the sound brighter and less resonant. She'd have to compensate play differently than she'd practiced. "Don't worry about it," Patricia said, seeing her concern. Devon learned to play on this piano. He knew how to make it sing despite its limitations. You can too. For the next hour, Lorraine practiced getting used to the instrument, finding its sweet spots and rough patches. Her fingers started to remember the different resistance the different touch required. By the time people started arriving, she felt almost comfortable with it. Almost. Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "I'm going to help set up chairs." "You okay here?" Lorraine nodded, though her heart was starting to race. Through the doorway, she could see people entering the hall. Former colleagues of Devon's. Teachers. Students. People from the neighborhood who remembered the prodigy who'd grown up here. People whose lives he'd touched with his music. So many people. More than she'd expected. The hall was filling up fast. "Mrs. Washington?" A voice behind her made her turn. An elderly man with kind eyes stood there, leaning on a cane. "You probably don't remember me. I'm James Jenkins. I was Mr. Jenkins's grandson." "Oh my goodness," Lorraine stood and shook his hand. "Your grandfather meant everything to Devon. He's the one who started all this. He loved that boy," James said, his eyes misty. "Talked about him until the day he died. Said Devon was going to change the world with his music. When I heard about this concert, about what you're doing, Granddad would have been so proud. Of Devon, of course, but also of you." "Thank you," Lorraine managed, her voice thick. More people came over to introduce themselves or reintroduce themselves. A former Juilliard classmate who'd flown in from California. A nurse from County General who remembered Lorraine from the old days. Two of Devon's piano students who wanted to share how much he'd influenced their lives. Each conversation was touching and overwhelming. Each person had a story about Devon, a memory, a moment when his music or his kindness had made a difference. Lorraine had known her son was talented, had known he was respected. But hearing these stories, seeing how many lives he'd touched, he was so much more than I understood, she whispered to Sarah. "You understand now," her daughter replied. "That's what matters." 15 minutes before the concert was scheduled to start, Patricia pulled Lorraine aside. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified." "Good. Channel that into the performance. Remember, this isn't about perfection. It's about honoring Devon, about finishing his gift, about love. What if I mess up? Then you mess up. And you keep playing, and everyone in that audience will understand and forgive because they know what this means, what you've done to get here." Patricia took her hands. "You've got this, Mrs. Washington. I believe in you. Sarah believes in you. Devon believed in you. Now you just need to believe in yourself." The hall was packed now. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. Hundreds of faces, all here for Devon, all here to hear his final composition played by his mother. Lorraine's heart hammered in her chest. This was real. This was happening. In just a few minutes, she'd walk onto that stage and play music composed by her brilliant son. Play the conversation they'd never been able to have. Play the love she'd struggled to express. Could she do it? Could she really do it? Sarah appeared at her side, hugging her tight. "Mama, I need to tell you something. Devon left me a letter too. Not in the piano, but with his lawyer to be given to me if he didn't make it. He wrote about you, about how much he loved you, about how he knew you struggled to understand his passion for music, but that it didn't matter because your love came through anyway in 1,000 different ways. He said the composition he wrote for you wasn't just a gift. It was a thank you for everything you'd given him, for everything you'd sacrificed, for making him possible." Lorraine's eyes filled with tears. He said so much more. But Mama, the point is, he never doubted your love. Never. And you shouldn't doubt his. This piece, this moment, it's the two of you finally speaking the same language, finally understanding each other completely. Patricia appeared. "It's time." Lorraine took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she'd been working toward for a year. The moment she'd been running from for 3 years before that. The moment that would close one chapter and open another. She thought of Devon, remembered his smile, his laugh, his hands flying across the piano keys. Remembered the baby she'd rocked to sleep singing lullabies. Remembered the boy who'd discovered his gift. Remembered the man he'd become brilliant and passionate and gone too soon. "I love you, baby," she whispered to the air. "I'm ready now. I'm ready to finish what you started." And with Sarah on one arm and Patricia on the other, Lorraine Washington walked toward the stage where her son's final composition waited to be brought to life. The applause when Lorraine walked onto the stage was warm and genuine, but she barely heard it. Her entire focus was on the piano on the bench, on the sheet music Patricia had placed on the music stand. One foot in front of the other. Don't trip. Don't fall. Just make it to the piano. She sat down, adjusted the bench height, positioned her feet on the pedals, the way Patricia had taught her. The hall grew quiet. Hundreds of people, all waiting, all watching. The silence was almost unbearable. Patricia had stepped to the podium at the side of the stage. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to honor Devon Washington's memory. 3 years ago, we lost an extraordinary musician, a generous teacher, and a beautiful soul. What you may not know is that before he died, Devon composed one final piece. He left it unfinished, hidden in his piano, with a request that his mother complete it. There was a murmur through the audience, people leaning forward, interested. Mrs. Lorraine Washington had never played piano before finding Devon's composition. At 58 years old, with no musical training, she made the decision to learn, to honor her son's final gift, to speak his language in the only way she could. What you're about to hear is the result of a year of dedication, of love, of a mother's promise to her son. So, ladies and gentlemen, Devon Washington's final composition for Mama, an unfinished symphony, completed and performed by Lorraine Washington. The applause was thunderous now, but Lorraine still couldn't fully process it. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. Her heart was beating so fast she thought she might pass out. The first few measures of the piece, the ones she'd practiced 10,000 times, seemed to have evaporated from her memory. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath. Thought of Devon's journal of the words he'd written. Thought of his faith in her, his belief that she could do this. Thought of the promise she'd made, the gift he'd left. And then she began to play. The opening notes were simple, just a few measures that established the theme. Her hands found them automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The melody was based on "His Eye is on the Sparrow," the lullaby she'd sung to Devon every night when he was small. In the audience, People recognized it. She could hear the soft intakes of breath, could feel the emotional resonance spreading through the room. The second phrase built on the first, adding complexity, adding Devon's voice to hers. This was where the composition showed his genius, his ability to take something simple and transform it into something transcendent. The harmonies were rich, unexpected, beautiful. Lorraine's hands moved across the keys, and for the first time since sitting down, she wasn't thinking about technique or mistakes. She was thinking about Devon, about the 1,000 nights she'd tucked him into bed, about his small hand in hers, about the way his eyes would close as she sang peaceful and trusting. The bridge section approached the one that had given her so much trouble. Her left hand had to maintain a steady rhythm, while her right hand played a melody that syncopated against it. For months, she hadn't been able to do it. But now somehow her hands knew what to do. She thought of Devon at 7 discovering the piano, the joy on his face, the wonder. The music flowed from her fingers, and she was no longer Lorraine Washington, retired nurse amateur pianist. She was a mother speaking to her son in the language he'd taught her. Each note was a word she'd never said. Each phrase was a conversation they'd never had. Each measure was an expression of love that transcended mortality. The middle section modulated to a minor key, darker and more complex. This was where Devon had woven in "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," but transformed, made mournful and beautiful. This was the section about loss, about grief, about the pain of saying goodbye too soon. Lorraine's eyes filled with tears, but she kept playing, kept her hands moving even as her vision blurred. This was Devon's expression of his own mortality, his understanding that he was leaving too soon, his sorrow at the pain he would cause. But the piece didn't stay in the minor key. It shifted back to major, to hope, to light. This was the part Devon had worked on in his final months when he was too weak to play, but could still compose in his head, still imagine music, even when his hands wouldn't cooperate. This was his message of hope, his reassurance that love doesn't end with death, his promise that he'd be okay, that she'd be okay, that the connection between them would survive anything. Lorraine played through the tears now streaming down her face. The notes were right there under her fingers, exactly where they needed to be. The piano was responding beautifully, singing despite its age and wear. Devon's voice was in every note, in every phrase, in every harmonic choice, and her voice was there too. The lullabies he'd transformed, the love he'd honored, the sacrifice he'd recognized. They were speaking together now, mother and son, across the boundary of death, finding understanding through music in a way they'd struggled to find through words. The climax of the piece approached the moment where all the themes came together in a glorious, complex culmination. Lorraine's hands flew across the keys, playing notes she couldn't believe she was capable of playing. The music swelled, filled the hall, touched every person in the audience. And then the resolution. The final section that brought everything back to simplicity. Back to the lullaby. Back to the beginning. The music slowed, softened, became gentle and peaceful. Devon's last musical statement wasn't dramatic or showy. It was tender. It was grateful. It was an expression of peace. The final chord hung in the air, sustained by the old upright piano's surprising resonance. Lorraine let it fade. Naturally. Didn't rush it. Let it say everything it needed to say. then silence. Absolute, complete silence. Lorraine sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys, tears streaming down her face. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd played Devon's composition from beginning to end without stopping, without falling apart, without failing. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5. Then someone in the audience began to applaud. The applause started with one person, then spread like wildfire through the hall. Within seconds, everyone was on their feet, clapping, crying, shouting their appreciation. The sound was overwhelming, almost frightening in its intensity. Lorraine sat frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. She'd expected polite applause, maybe courtesy clapping for a brave attempt. She hadn't expected this. This outpouring of emotion, this standing ovation that showed no signs of stopping. Patricia appeared beside her, helping her stand, guiding her to take a bow. "You did it," she whispered, her own face wet with tears. "You finished his gift. You honored him perfectly." Sarah was there too, climbing onto the stage with tears streaming down her face, wrapping her mother in a hug so tight Lorraine could barely breathe. "Mama, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Devon was right there with you. I could feel him." The applause continued. People were wiping their eyes, holding each other, visibly moved by what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just appreciation for a musical performance. This was recognition of something deeper. A mother's love, a son's faith, a promise kept across the boundary of death. As the applause finally began to die down, people started approaching the stage. One of Devon's former Juilliard professors, an elegant woman in her 70s, took Lorraine's hands. "That was extraordinary, Mrs. Washington. Not just technically, though you played far better than you probably realize, but emotionally, spiritually. I've heard thousands of performances in my life, but I've never heard anything that moved me quite like this. Devon's gift to you and your gift back to him, it's perfect." One of Devon's students, a young man Lorraine vaguely recognized from the funeral, was openly sobbing. "He talked about you all the time he managed, about how much he loved you, how much he wished you understood his music. He'd be so proud of you right now. So incredibly proud." More people came, each with something to say, each touched by the performance in their own way. Lorraine tried to respond, tried to thank them, but she was overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, barely able to string words together. Eventually, Patricia and Sarah managed to extract her from the crowd, leading her to a quiet room backstage where she could sit down and breathe. "I can't believe I did that," Lorraine whispered. "I can't believe I actually played it in front of all those people." "You didn't just play it," Patricia said. "You brought it to life. You completed Devon's vision. You made his final composition into something real and beautiful and meaningful." "I made so many mistakes," Lorraine said, suddenly aware of all the wrong notes, the missed dynamics, the imperfect execution. "No one cared about the mistakes," Sarah interjected. "No one even noticed. They were too busy being moved by the story you were telling, by the love you were expressing." Patricia nodded. "Perfect technique isn't what makes music meaningful. Emotion is. Connection is. Truth is. And what you played tonight was true. Deeply, profoundly true." There was a gentle knock on the door. A woman in her 60s poked her head in, looking hesitant. "Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Rebecca Martinez. I was Devon's manager. Victoria." Lorraine remembered her from years ago, polished and professional, talking about European tours and recording contracts. She looked older now, softer somehow. "I just wanted to tell you," Victoria continued, "that I've been thinking about Devon every day since he died. Thinking about all the music he never got to create, all the performances that will never happen. It's haunted me, this sense of unfinished business. But tonight, I finally feel like there's closure. His final composition has been heard. His last musical statement is complete. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving us this gift. After Victoria left, others came. More of Devon's colleagues, former students, people from the neighborhood who'd watched him grow up. Each person had a story, a memory, a moment when Devon's music or kindness had touched them. Lorraine listened to them all, amazed at how many lives her son had influenced, how many people he'd inspired, how much light he'd brought into the world in his too short 29 years. He would have been embarrassed by all this attention, she told Sarah at one point, smiling through fresh tears. He never liked making things about himself. He always said the music should speak, not the musician. Well, the music spoke tonight, Sarah replied. Loud and clear. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The community center started to close down. Patricia drove Lorraine home, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for most of the drive. What happens now? Lorraine asked, as they pulled up to her house. What do you mean I've spent a year working toward this moment? Practicing, preparing, building up to this performance. Now it's over. What do I do with all this skill I've developed with the piano sitting in my living room? Do I just stop? Patricia smiled. That's up to you. You could stop if you want. You've accomplished what you set out to do. But you could also keep going, keep learning, keep playing. Devon's piece doesn't have to be the only music you ever make. The idea hadn't occurred to Lorraine. She'd been so focused on completing Devon's composition that she hadn't thought beyond it. But now sitting here, she realized something she didn't want to stop. Playing piano had become more than just a way to honor Devon. It had become a way to understand herself, to express things she couldn't say with words, to connect with something larger than her day-to-day existence. I think I want to keep learning, she said slowly. Not to perform again necessarily, but just to keep speaking this language Devon taught me. I think that's beautiful, Patricia said, and I'd be honored to keep teaching you. That night alone in her house, Lorraine sat at the Steinway in her living room. She pulled out Devon's journal, opened it to a random page, and read, I've been thinking about legacy a lot lately. What I'll leave behind when I'm gone. For a long time, I thought my legacy would be my performances, my recordings, the music I created. But I'm starting to think the real legacy is the way we touch other people's lives. The students I teach, the audiences I move, the conversations I have, the love I share. Maybe that's the music that really matters. Not the notes on a page, but the hearts that are changed. Lorraine closed the journal and placed her hands on the piano keys. She played through For Mama one more time, slowly and quietly, just for herself, just for Devon. And this time playing it, she heard things she hadn't heard before, heard the layers of meaning in every phrase, heard the conversation they were having even now, even after everything, heard the love that transcended death, that bridged understanding, that made impossible things possible. When she finished, she sat in the silence for a long time. Then she smiled. "Thank you, baby," she whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for teaching me your language. Thank you for this gift." The piano sat silent, but Lorraine didn't need it to respond. She knew with absolute certainty that Devon had heard her, that wherever he was proud, that the promise she'd made had been kept. And that was enough. 6 months after the memorial concert, Lorraine Washington stood in the community center for the first time since that transformative night. But she wasn't there to perform. She was there to teach. The program had been Sarah's idea. "Mama, you should share what you've learned. Not just the piano skills, but the whole experience. The way music can bridge understanding, can heal grief, can connect us to people we've lost. So Lorraine had partnered with the community center to start a piano program for adults. Not professional training, not preparation for concert careers, just an opportunity for people to discover music later in life, to challenge themselves to learn a new language of expression. The first session had 12 students ranging in age from 40 to 72. They sat in a circle of folding chairs around the old upright piano, looking nervous and excited in equal measure. "Welcome," Lorraine said, smiling at them. "I want to start by telling you a story about my son." She shared Devon's journey, his gift, his too short life. She talked about finding the hidden composition, about the promise she'd made, about the year of struggle and growth that followed. She didn't sugarcoat the difficulty. She was honest about the frustration, the doubt, the moments when she'd wanted to quit. "But I kept going," she said, "because it wasn't really about learning piano. It was about understanding my son, about finishing something he'd started, about speaking his language. And in the process, I discovered something I didn't expect." "What's that?" one of the students asked. "That I was learning to understand myself, too. That music isn't just about the notes you play. It's about the emotions you express, the connections you make, the ways you grow. Every piece you learn is a conversation. Every practice session is a meditation. Every performance is an act of vulnerability and courage." She sat at the piano and played the opening measures of "For Mama," the simple melody based on "His Eye is on the Sparrow." "This is where I started. Just this. One hand, one melody. It felt impossible at first. But I learned it. And then I learned the next part. And the next. And eventually, piece by piece, I completed something I never thought I could do." The students listened rapt. Lorraine could see in their faces the same mixture of hope and fear she'd felt a year and a half ago. The desire to try something new, tempered by the certainty that they were too old, too inexperienced, too set in their ways. "Here's what I want you to understand," she said gently. "You're never too old to learn. You're never too far behind to start. And the music doesn't care if you're perfect. It only cares if you're sincere. If you bring your whole heart to it, if you're willing to be vulnerable and brave, the music will meet you where you are." After the class, as students were leaving, a woman in her 60s approached Lorraine. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "My daughter died 2 years ago. She was a violinist. I've been thinking about learning violin to feel closer to her, but I thought I was being silly. An old woman trying to play an instrument. But hearing about you and Devon, maybe it's not silly after all." Lorraine took her hands. "It's not silly. It's beautiful and brave and exactly what your daughter would want." That evening, Lorraine sat at her Steinway and played. Not For Mama this time, but a new piece Patricia had given her, a simple Bach invention. She was working on it slowly, carefully, learning to hear the multiple voices weaving together, learning to make each line sing. Her fingers moved across the keys with a confidence she never would have imagined 2 years ago. She still made mistakes. She still struggled with complex passages. But she didn't let that stop her anymore. Didn't let imperfection become an excuse to give up. Because she'd learned something from Devon, from his final gift, from this impossible journey she'd undertaken. She'd learned that the point wasn't perfection. It was connection, expression, growth, love. The piano had stopped being her rival years ago. Now it was her friend, her teacher, her link to a son who lived on in every note she played. On the music stand beside the Bach sat a framed photo of Devon. 17 years old, sitting at this very piano in his apartment, his hands poised above the keys, his face radiant with joy. Sarah had given her the photo after the memorial concert, and Lorraine kept it here, a reminder of why she'd started this journey. But increasingly, she didn't need the reminder. Playing piano had become its own reward. The challenge of learning, the satisfaction of improvement, the meditative quality of practice, the emotional release of performance. These things had value independent of Devon's memory, though of course he was always there. In every piece she played, in every lesson she taught, in every moment of frustration overcome, and every small victory celebrated. Lorraine finished the Bach invention and sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. Through the window, she could see the sun setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. The whole world was beautiful if you stopped long enough to notice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "How did the first class go?" Lorraine smiled and typed back, "Perfect. They're ready to learn. And I'm ready to teach them everything Devon taught me about perseverance and passion and love." "He'd be proud of you," Patricia replied. "Of the teacher you've become. Of the musician you've become. Of the person you've always been." Lorraine set the phone down and looked at Devon's photo again. 29 years old when he died. A lifetime of music never created, of students never taught, of love never shared. It was a tragedy, would always be a tragedy. But from that tragedy had come something beautiful too. A mother learning her son's language, a gift completed across the boundary of death. A new generation of students inspired to try something impossible. A legacy that would continue to ripple outward, touching lives Devon would never meet, creating connections he'd never imagined. "I understand now," baby Lorraine whispered to the photo, to the memory, to the presence she still felt whenever she played. "I finally understand. The music was never about leaving me. It was about showing me who you were. And now playing your piano, teaching your language. I'm showing you who I am too. I'm finishing our conversation, and it's beautiful." She placed her hands on the keys one more time and began to play. Not for an audience, not for a performance, just for herself, for Devon, for the pure joy of making music. The notes floated through the house, through the open window, out into the evening air. Somewhere Lorraine liked to think Devon was listening, smiling, proud of his mama for learning what he'd tried so hard to teach her. That love doesn't require understanding to be real, but understanding makes it deeper, richer, more complete. And now finally, after everything, they understood each other. Mother and son. Speaking the same language at last. The music played on a bridge between worlds, a conversation that would never end, a love that death could not silence. And in the fading light of a perfect evening, Lorraine Washington played her son's song and knew with absolute certainty that she had kept her promise. She had finished what he started, and in doing so, had discovered her own beginning.